Hi there, welcome to Con Artists. We are here this week with Buzz Dixon, former writer for G.I. Joe, Transformers, My Little Pony, Inhumanoids, Gem and the Holograms, a great number. Oh, Thundar the Barbarian. There's a great number of 1980s, 1990s cartoon. Buzz has worked with us. We've got Cuddle Buddy Frankie. Thank you for producing, and I am here. We are missing Jane Doe, but that's all right. We want to hear your questions, and we want to hear your questions. Get your likes and shares, and we'll just kind of start with the conversation. Buzz, how are you doing this evening?
I'm doing very well, thank you.
Excellent. How did you get involved in so many writing projects? You wrote so much of my childhood.
Thank you.
Where did you get that?
Well,
how did you get into the business?
I had been interested in science fiction fandom when I was in my teens and whatnot. My family moved a lot, and as a result, I got involved in fandom because with fandom, you were never further away than your mailbox from your friends. So I got involved and interested in science fiction, and like most young fans, I tried writing my own stories. I was drafted while I was still in high school in 1972. I mean, they actually came and drafted me, and I said, "But you can't draft me. I haven't graduated yet." And they said, "Well, we'll wait until you graduate." And I said, "But what if I flunk?" And they said, No. We've already talked with your teachers. You're not flunking, so we got you." And they drafted me. Yeah, I was in the Army 3 days after school. So
oh my God.
I spent military. I got married while I was in the military. After I was discharged in 78, I had applied for and had been accepted by USC's film school. And so I was discharged in about February of 78, and we came to Southern California. And my thought was, since the school didn't start until about October, I would find a job at one of the studios, driver in the mailroom, something like that, just to get my feet wet before actually going to film school. So I started at the top at Universal, and I worked my way down until I got pretty close to the bottom of the barrel, which was Filmation. And I went into Filmation Studios with my resume. The woman, the receptionist, asked, applying for an animation job or a live action job? Well, I'm no artist, so I said, well, live action, I guess. And she said, wait a minute. Goes in the back, and she comes out, and she says, Arthur, and she's referring to Arthur Nadell, who was a producer there, said Arthur doesn't have anything to do. Basically, we're on hiatus in terms of live action, and he said, "Yeah, come on back, and he'll talk to you." So Arthur was a really sweet guy, and I went back and had a conversation with him, and he asked me about my background, and I told him about being a newspaper editor for the U.S. Army, and I told him about having written short stories. Hadn't sold any at that point, but I had written a number of short stories. And he mentioned they were having difficulty coming up with ideas for an animated show that they were doing. The show was called Sunbright and Starlight, or Moonlight and Ultrabright, or Jebusite and Amalekite, something like that. I don't know. It was two fraternal twin girls, one of whom had superpowers in the daytime, the other had superpowers at the nighttime. So they were having difficulty coming up with ideas. And Arthur said, if you have some of your short stories, I'd love to look at them. But also, he says, I can't tell you to do this. If you're interested, if you want to come up with some ideas for this show, come up with some ideas and I'll take a look at them too. So the first thing I did was give him some of my short stories to look at. And then I went back and I started working on ideas for the show. And what I didn't know was that he read my short stories and he sent them by FedEx to Hawaii, where Lou Scheimer was on vacation. And you got to remember, in 1978, sending something FedEx to Hawaii, that was a really big deal. Okay, this was not, a casual bid. So he sent my short stories to Lou Scheimer. And in the interim, I came up with some story ideas for him for the other show, and I brought him in. And when Lou came back, the story ideas that I had written for the show were sitting on his desk. And Lou looked at them and read them. And he called Arthur and he said, Arthur, I don't know who we should hire. I don't know if we should hire the guy who wrote the short stories or the guy who wrote the premises. And Arthur said, it's the same guy. And Lou said, get him. And so they asked if I wanted to scripts for them. And I thought, well, writing scripts in an air-conditioned office is certainly better than driving a delivery truck. So I said, yeah, I'll do that. And I started writing scripts for Filmation Studios, and I was working with Arthur. We had Sam Simon, who later went on to be one of the co-creators of the Simpsons TV show, was working for us at the time. Yeah. There was a great, irascible old radio writer named Bill Danch. Bill also wrote one of Corman's first monster movies, The Monster from the Ocean Floor. Bill Danch was there. We had two guys, Chuck Menville and Lynn Jansen, who were not only filmmakers, but they were also story editors, and they taught me an enormous amount about the craft and whatnot. And so I started working for them. And by the time October rolled around and it was time to go to school, I'm making too much money to go to school. So I figured, well, I'll just stay on with this until, it runs out. Then I can go to school next year. There never was a next year.
Yeah. That's an awesome success story.
Well, it's
okay, but hearing
go for it. College, I was very, very fortunate. I was lucky to be there at the moment that Arthur Nadell was bored and needed something to do. Otherwise, I might not.
So my question is, coming from that background, did some of your ideas for G.I. Joe ever come from from your military service?
Oh, yes.
Because it seems like two different worlds, but yeah.
That's, in fact.
Do you have any examples of that?
That was why Steve Gerber wanted to bring me on board for the series. Steve knew. I met Steve when I was working at Ruby Spears. He was a story editor there, and we had worked on Thundar together. But Steve knew my military background, and when he took the story editor position at G.I. Joe, he sent me some of the scripts, and he asked me to look at, I think, the series that they had done, and he asked for feedback. And I said, well, basically, they're entertaining stories, but they don't really seem to understand how a military unit operates. I mean, they've got sergeants giving orders to colonels. In the first one, they had jet planes swooping down and slicing tanks in half with their wingtips. I said, this is just not the way the real world military works. So Steve gave me a couple of scripts to look at, and I gave him some feedback on issues that were problematic, specific, relating to how the military was depicted. And he asked, well, would you like to come on board, work for us? So they gave me a freelance script to do, Haul Down the Heavens, which was my first one. And based on that, they hired me as a staff writer, and I very quickly became the assistant story editor. And then for the second season, they promoted me to story editor on G.I. Joe.
Awesome. What's your favorite G.I. Joe episode?
I have to say.
Or do you have a favorite?
Well, I do, and I have to say it's The Traitor, because it was the one that I felt I was allowed to actually do a real drama, so to speak. story, for those who may not be familiar with it or may not remember it, is that one of the Joes, his mother has severe health problems, and he's trying to take care of her, but it's costly. And Cobra approaches him, Dusty Rudat, and they approach Dusty, and they basically say, "Look, we're not asking you to betray GI Joe. Just give us a hint of where the Joes are going to be, so we can avoid them." And Dusty allows himself to be compromised because he used the money to take care of his mother. And this resonated very strongly with our viewers because the kids could understand that. The kids could understand, oh my gosh, my mom is sick. I would want to take care of her, but would I be willing to cooperate with Cobra to do something wrong to take care of my mother? And it worked really. It was a two-parter. I believe it was the second appearance of Ramirez, and it used Hector instead of a standard in our last episode type opening. We had Hector program recapping the previous episode as if it was a news story. And from there, unintentionally, we went on to link all of the G.I. Joe universes through, not G.I. Joe, but almost all of the Sunbow toy universes through Hector Ramirez.
Yeah, well, he does show up quite a bit in a number of those cartoons, doesn't he? How did you manage that? Like, just you didn't intend to,
well,
or did you?
Well, what happened was when you create a character for animation, you get a design voice, but you also have to get the name approved. You couldn't have a character who was a newscaster named Hector Ramirez if there was a real Hector Ramirez who was a newscaster, for instance. And so
sure, that makes sense.
Once Hasbro's legal department had signed off Hector Ramirez, he wasn't a product character like Joe's were or Cobra characters were, just one of our background characters we could use again and again if we needed to. So once we had an accepted newscaster character, whenever we had to do an information dump, whenever we had to, give the audience a lot of stuff just straight out, it was logical to use Hector because you could bring Hector in and Hector could be doing a news story and he could tell the audience whatever they needed to know. Well, once he approved, and since he wasn't a product in any particular line, all the other shows started using him. I mean, Transformers used him, Gem, Inhumanoids. Whenever you needed that info dump, you grabbed Hector, and Hector would come on with his microphone, and he would say, yes, so-and-so is doing such and such, and this thing happened, and that thing happened. And he could logically just tell you straight out all the information you needed to know for that particular episode. And as a result, we ended up backdoor linking G.I. Joe, Transformers, Gem, and the Inhumanoids.
Well, I know G.I. Joe and Transformers partnered up a couple of different times, and then a little later, it would have been much later with Old Man Snake when Cobra Commander ended up being in the Transformers universe. But how do you think Gem and them? Do you think Gem might have survived in a world where there's Cobra Commander and G.I. Joe and Transformers going on?
Well, insofar as that the entire world wasn't engaged in these things 24/7. If we do a G.I. Joe story, it's about that particular locale and what's happening then and there. 50 miles away, nobody even knows it's going on. And it would be like that with Gem. Gem is in the entertainment industry. People still need entertainment in times of stress. You might even argue that they need more entertainment in times of stress. And so while the Joe Transformers and the Inhumanoids are having these bizarre adventures popping up all around the globe, Gem and the holograms, they are a hit pop group. They're out there performing. They have fans. People are watching them. Same way with the Andrews sisters, too.
Yeah. Hey, so I've got a question. Animation is fairly expensive, and it used to be so much more so. How did you decide? How did the group decide? The editors decide which stories were to move on into animation?
Well, we
How did that go?
well we started simply by coming up with stories. We were given every series you work on. You have what's called a series Bible, which describes the world or the universe the series is set in, describes the characters. It usually gives some examples of the type of conflicts, stories they would be involved in, and then you hand these out to the writers, and you ask them to come up with stories that fit into it. Filmation, going back to them for a moment, Filmation was so cost conscious. They would, in addition to the Bible, they would hand you a stock animation book of all their stock animation and say, when you're writing the script, go through here and pull out already animated scenes that we can just run in, create new stuff. But for the Joes and for Transformers and things like that, basically, if you could write it, it would get animated. And about the only time that there would ever be any kind of limitations would be perhaps just by the sheer number of voices that you could employ in a certain episode. I'm going to pluck a number off the top of my head, and it may not be an accurate number, so don't hold me to it. But if they had a budget for 12 voice actors, they wouldn't want you consistently calling for 17 voice actors. They might give you 14 voice one time, but then you had to make up for it by only having 10 voice actors the next time. That would be about the only restriction.
So how did you get from doing G.I. Joe into Transformers into all the others working for the same company? And did you say you said another name that wasn't Hasbro? That was another animation company. Were there two that you worked for, or?
Well, I worked for several animation companies. By the late 80s, I had worked for every animation company in existence at that point. Excuse me, strike that. By the mid 90s, I had worked for every animation company in existence, including Disney, Warner Brothers, and every other Saturday morning show that was out there. I had started at Filmation, and from Filmation, when they went on hiatus, I was looking for work. I sold a couple of scripts to a studio called Ruby Spears. This was Joe Ruby and Ken Spears studio. They had created Scooby-Doo over at Hanna-Barbera, and they had been turned loose from Hanna-Barbera, and they had their own studio. ABC was funding them to have somebody other than Hanna-Barbera that they could get animated shows from. So I sold a couple of them. I think I worked on the Mighty Man segments. They had a show called Plastic Man and Mighty Man and Yuck, and I worked on the Mighty Man episodes, not any of the Plastic episodes. And from there, I hired as a staff writer, and I met Steve Gerber there. I met Flint Dilley. I met Mark. Tons of people who later ended up working at Sunbow, either on staff or freelance. And in fact, as I said earlier, when Steve went to Sunbow to be the story editor for G.I. Joe, he brought me along. And Sunbow they were based in New York, but they had a West Coast office, which was located in Westwood in Los Angeles. And we were upstairs above I think it was a sandwich shop. I'm not 100% certain. But we had a very nice office layout, and we had, space for the story editors, for the staff writers, and there was, there's about 6 or 8 of us working together in the studio space, we called it. I mean, it was offices, and whenever somebody did help on a show, you helped. And so if the Transformer people said, hey, we got to get a couple of episodes in the can so that we can get back on schedule, well, you'd knock out a Transformer episode for them. If My Little Pony needed some help, My Little Pony, you go over there and do some My Little Pony episodes. So we ended up writing, if you were on staff, you pretty much ended up writing for every show at some point or another, simply because you were in the office, and when they needed help, you helped.
Huh.
So what show have you done the most writing for?
It would be G.I. Joe, and not just number of scripts that I have written, but also in the story editing. I make it a practice never to put my name on a script that I have story edited, no matter how much rewriting I have done. And there are a couple of G.I. Joe scripts attributed to other writers that were virtually page one rewrites by me. And there were several others that had massive changes in them that I had put in order to bring them up to speed. So that would probably be the single show that I did most on. Though I also did a lot of episodes of Thundar the Barbarian over at Ruby Spears.
So now, what's like the main difference between a writer and a story editor?
If you're a story editor, you get to do it to the writer. The writer doesn't get to do it to the story. Basically, the story editor is hired on the presumption that they understand what it is that the show is trying to do, both the also in terms of practical limits. I just mentioned you were limited by the number of voices you could have in an episode. The story editor is supposed to tell a writer, if they're pitching a story that would have like 40 voices in it, no, that's too many voices, let's trim it back. The story editor listens to a pitch, picks an idea that he thinks is interesting, either has the writer develop it on his own or her own, or works with them to develop what would be called a premise, which would be about a paragraph, anywhere from 2 to 3 sentences, a short paragraph explaining what the basic idea is and broadly how it would pay out. It would then go to producer. In Sunbow's case, it would go all the way to Hasbro. In Ruby Spears' case, it would go to Joe Ruby. At Filmation, it would go to Lou Scheimer. They would look at it and say, okay, yeah, develop this. And then it would go to outline. The outline was where you would do the scene-by-scene beats of the show. You would have some indication of the dialogue. You would basically have a good idea of what the episode would actually look like once the script was written. Then it goes through the same process again. It's passed up the line until it gets approval, and then when it's approved, and there may be changes in it, when it's approved, it goes back to the writer, and the writer is told to write a script. And the story editor's job is just to make sure it stays focused, it stays where it's supposed to be in terms of the story, in terms of what the show is doing. We would sometimes get people pitching ideas that were wildly off course for a particular series. I won't mention the series by name because if by chance the writer is listening, I do not want to embarrass them.
Yeah.
Someone came in and pitched a story where one of the characters is accused of robbing gas stations, basically. And I said, no. At the scale this series operates at, they could be falsely accused of robbing Fort Knox. You do not want them falsely accused of robbing gas stations. there's no logical reason for this person to rob a gas station. Yes, there's a logical reason that they would want to rob Fort Knox. And that's a case of where I just said, it would take too much work to get this to operate the way it should, so we ignored that and we went with a different idea. But that's very typical of what a story editor would do. Making sure the characters are all speaking in the same voice, or the consistent voices. When you've got a character like Roadblock who speaks with kind of this quasi-rap rhyming type dialogue and whatnot, well, you just go through and whenever possible make sure he says something that rhymes. Likewise, if you have a character who's very taciturn, doesn't speak a lot, you go back and you trim it down. You make them sound more like Clint Eastwood. If you have somebody like Shipwreck, well, Steve Gerber made the great observation, you write Shipwreck like Popeye, you play him like Jack Nicholson. So, you look at Shipwreck's document, say, what would Popeye say? And there you go.
And how would Jack Nicholson say it? That's awesome. I want to know.
If you remember,
go ahead.
It sounds like Jack Nicholson.
Huh? Yeah. Oh, absolutely. It's right on. I want to know was there a script? Was there an episode? And it could be of just about anything that you've worked on that was so like it got to you and you didn't expect it to, and you weren't sure if you should get it produced or not. Like, is there an episode out there that really shocked you when it came to you?
In terms of episodes that shocked me when they came to me, I can't think of any. The classic story along those lines is Steve Gerber on a Tuesday afternoon, made a joke about the viper coming to bite the windows. And, he made it at lunch and we all laughed at it. And then Friday, he had a Monday deadline for a script that he had no idea. And boom, it becomes the Viper episode of G.I. Joe. And, sheer desperation. That's how that got written.
Yeah.
I had not so much it shocked me, but I had an idea when I was story editing the second season of G.I. Joe. I wanted to do kind of the origin of Cobra, not the actual origin, but at least indicate something about the origin of Cobra in our version. And Larry Hama had been doing the character bios for the product line, and he had also been writing the comic book for Marvel. But Larry had certain parameters that he could fill in the comic book that we weren't allowed to touch. And likewise, we had certain things that we had to keep in mind that Larry, wouldn't work in Larry's comic. So while we were with each other, we didn't try to emulate each other. And I wanted to do a story that would explain in the G.I. Joe animated universe where Cobra had come from. And it was going to be called The Most Dangerous Man in the World. And it was basically about the Friedrich Nietzsche, Karl Marx philosopher who came up with the operating philosophy of Cobra. And he had been imprisoned by Cobra because Cobra had so badly interpreted his philosophy and had corrupted it so much that, he was trying to warn people, don't listen to Cobra. And so they had him in to keep him from warning anybody. He escapes from prison. Cobra immediately ceases all of its worldwide operations and searches for him. The Joes have no idea who he is or why he's important to Cobra, but they just know if Cobra wants him, we got to get to him first. So there's this chase to find this philosopher. And then when the Joes find him, they find out he is just a royal pain in the ass. He's pedantic. He's a know-it-all. I mean, he just annoys the crap out of the Joes and escapes from the Joes as well. And when he escapes from the Joes' attitude was going to be, let him go. He's out there causing trouble for what do we care? So I had come up with this idea. I came up with the premise. Hasbro liked it. They approved it. I came up with a neat outline. They approved that, and they said, "Yeah, go to script. Just have a space in there. Make sure you include the Cobra Emperor in there." And I said, "The Cobra what?" And they said, "The Cobra Emperor." And I said, "Well, who's the Cobra Emperor?"
Huh.
And they said, "Well, he's the supreme commander of Cobra." And I said, "No, he's not." I said, "We've spent an entire season and who knows how many miniseries telling people that Cobra Commander is the supreme commander of Cobra." I said, "If you had wanted to hint there was somebody above Cobra Commander, we could have dropped little clues. But, we just can't bring a brand new commander in without explaining why. Where did he come from?" So they said, "Okay, come up with some ideas to explain where the new leader comes from." So Cobra Emperor, who later becomes Serpentor, at one point called King Cobra, and I was going yes, because there was nothing I wanted more than to have a villain named after a malt liquor. But unfortunately, the legal department at Hasbro, they realized King malt liquor, and so they changed the name to Serpentor. In any case, they asked me to come up with some ideas, and I came up with 2 ideas. And I tell young writers, if anybody asks you to come up with 2 or more ideas, don't. Come up with the idea you want to do, because if the people hiring you were creative, they wouldn't be hiring you. They would be coming up with ideas on their own. And I had 2. The first one was that Cobra, frustrated with Cobra Commander's incompetence, basically creates a brand new leader. And this was the Arise Serpentor Arise miniseries that we did. The other idea was some shadowy organization behind Cobra that was secretly funding them and whatnot. And the Serpentor came from that group. So I sent both ideas to Hasbro, and Hasbro said, "We love them, go with it." And I said, "Go with which one?" And they said, "Both." So we did Rise to explain, collecting the DNA from all of these great military leaders of the past. We did that miniseries. And then the G.I. Joe movie, we did what became Cobra Law. And when we were putting this together, the idea of this lost civilization that was secretly responsible, I forget why we selected the Himalayas, but we ended up selecting the Himalayas as where this lost civilization would be located. And I said, as a placeholder name until we come up with something, let's call it Cobra Law. Because I figured Hasbro's legal department would go, "No, you can't name a lost civilization after one of the most famous lost civilizations in literature, Shangri-La from James Hilton's Lost Horizon." And they would keep us from doing it. Instead, Hasbro loved it. And I said, no, we can't do that. We can't do that. We can't call it. It's too close to Shangri-La. No, we're fine with it. Not a problem for us. So they ended up calling this lost civilization Cobra Law. And I have been apologizing for that ever since. If I had had any idea that they were going to go with Cobra Law, instead of Cobra Law, I would have called it, Festering Monkey Hemorrhoid Island. I would have called it Granny's Body House. I would have come up with some name other than Cobra Law. That's the other bit of advice I give. I said, if you have to use a placeholder name, use the most vile placeholder name you possibly can to keep anybody from falling in love with it and actually using it.
Now,
Awesome.
I have a question. As a writer, did you get to name your episodes that you wrote?
Yes, we did. On rare occasion, Hasbro would have a change, but it was typically a tweak instead of a complete change. The Trader was originally called Dusty Rudat Trader. Hasbro decided they liked the traitor. It was much more forceful as just, one word. And okay, fine. I mean, it didn't harm the story, so we went with it.
What is your favorite episode that you have named?
What's the what's your title?
In terms of titles, I actually like Haul Down the Heavens. I mean, I thought that was a pretty nifty title, even though the episode I thought, in retrospect, ended up being a very, I won't say generic, but a very typical G.I. Joe episode. Whenever they would hire somebody to do the original, come on board, typically because of the network restrictions that we had suffered under when we were writing for network animated shows, the first shows that we would do would be these balls to the wall, all out, just completely crazed slugfests. And then after that, we'd go, can I do something different? Do I have to keep writing these big, massive battle scenes all the time? And that's one of the reasons why G.I. Joe and Transformers became as interesting as they were. Once we got the big fights out of our system early on, then we started finding other things to do with the characters. So I think in terms of liking the title, Haul Down the Heavens was probably my favorite title, even though the episode was not as strong as The Traitor, for instance.
So we've got an online question. Kayla wants to know, what's your favorite character?
In G.I. Joe? Oh, Shipwreck. Shipwreck. Yeah. Oh, I fell in love with Shipwreck the first time I laid eyes on him. I mean, it's just like, to me, he represented everything I wanted to do with G.I. Joe, because he is the loose cannon. He's the guy who can say the things nobody else can say. He's the guy who's the goofball who can do the stuff that other people can't do. And there's one of those guys in every unit. I mean, this is one of the things that I brought from my military experience. In every unit, there is one complete flake, and Shipwreck was our flake. And I just, the moment I had a chance to use him, I started using him, and I kept using him.
Was there ever a character that was so over the top that you were just like, I can't believe we're using him? Are we really going with this character? Is this? Are we doing this really? Was there ever one of those moments?
In the Hasbro Sunbow series, no. Sergeant Slaughter came as close to going over the top as you could, but we're just writing Sarge. I mean, he was already there. We weren't creating him. He was just, well, what would the Sarge say? Well, that's pretty much what the Sarge would say. So,
Right.
There were some other shows that we worked on where there were characters that were just god awful, and when I was working at Ruby Spears, they had a series called Goldie Gold and Action Jack, and the origin of this was ABC had Richie Rich on, and Richie Rich was very successful. And Richie Rich in the animated series is about 10 to 12 years old. In the comic books, he's 6 or 8. And they said, well, we want to do a teenage version of Richie Rich, but a female teenage version of Richie Rich. So they had Ruby Spears came up with a character called Goldie Gold, who was this billionaire teenage girl who had no visible parents, and would have these wild globe-trotting adventures with her friend Action Jack. And I remember, because Steve Gerber and I just had the worst time in the world. I mean, we'd be sitting in story meetings and saying, this does not make sense. Where are her parents? There's an innocence with a 6-year-old child or a 10-year-old child having an enormous amount of money, so much money that it's physically impossible to deal with it. I mean, look at all the gags that come out of Richie Rich that are just he's literally tripping over money. He has so much of it lying around everywhere. There's an innocence to that. Don't have that innocence with a teenager. And then there was stuff that was, well, I'll give you an example. We were having a story meeting in Joe Ruby's office, and you got to imagine that there is Joe at his desk. There are two big armchairs, high wing armchairs. There's a couch, and then they bring in extra chairs, all the writers and artists. And so I'm in one of the big wing armchairs, and we've turned it around so I can face Joe at his desk. And sitting directly behind me is was a storyboard artist who later became an animation director for Bob's Burgers and other shows. A guy named Gordon Kent, really nice guy. Gordon deliberately, he's a short guy, he's a little guy, and he deliberately sat behind me and just leaned back on the couch and went to sleep. He took a nap in the middle of the meeting because my bulk in the chair were blocking him from Joe's view. And so we're trying to hash out the first episode of Goldie Gold, and there's a ski chase in it. And Joe Ruby is going, could we have, in the middle of this chase, all of a sudden, a giant squid erupts out of a snowbank and tries to grab him? And Gordon woke up just in time to Gordon woke up just in time to hear that, and he said, "Yeah, we could animate it, but who would want to?" And there was like dead silence in the room, and then I started laughing, and everybody else started laughing, and Joe decided to treat it as a joke. But damn, we had a giant squid come out of the snowbank in that episode and try to grab Goldie Gold and Action Jack. The punchline is this. About 6 months later, when the show is on the air, Parents Magazine is reviewing the Saturday morning shows, and they're reviewing that episode of Goldie Gold and Action Jack. And the opening line of the review is, "We suppose it's possible to animate a giant squid coming out of a snowbank to grab somebody, but who would want to?"
That's amazing. But it makes me, I've got that dirty mind, and like Bob Saget is America's dad, but he's one of the most filthy comedians out there.
Yeah.
Mr. Wizard was on air, but he's certainly got his thing. There are people who do all of these work for children, but they're very adult after that. Have you done any adult writing or anything along those lines?
Oh, I was, for about 90 days, I was an editor at Penthouse Comics in the mid-90s. And Penthouse Comics was a magazine format comic book. It was the same size, paper, stock, and print quality of the regular Penthouse magazine, only it had... it started out with R-rated adventures and comedy-type stories in it. When I was asked to come on board, the material that was shown me was kind of Roger Corman-esque, over the top, a little tongue-in-cheek, but it was stuff that you would see in an R-rated drive-in movie or something like that. And then once I got with them, the situation deteriorated very, very rapidly. The co-creator of the line and the editor-in-chief of the line, he had some personal problems, including substance abuse, and basically about 3 months in, I recognized, I'm gonna, somebody's gonna end up dead in the hospital or in jail, and it ain't gonna be me. And so I basically, I resigned. I said, I'm not going to stay around much longer for this. And I proved to be an accurate judge, because about 10 or 11 days after I resigned, the editor-in-chief committed suicide in a rather spectacular manner. He went to the Marriott Marquis in downtown Manhattan and took a dive off the top of a 44-story atrium.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, the takeaway is, don't embezzle money from guys whose last names end in vowels, because he had been funding his drug hobby with money that he had been scamming off of Bob Guccione. So Guccione was going to give him a chance to set things right, but I think he just realized he was in too deep, mentally, personally, emotionally, and everything else, and he just did himself in. But yes, we had a number of characters that we did that were either inspired by or based on normally, comic code approved characters and story ideas. And, we did those. I didn't have a problem doing the kind of R-rated material they were doing, but as I said, when I was there, the longer I worked for them, the more bizarre and, well, frankly, repugnant some of the stuff was getting. I mean, it not just working conditions, but also the types of stories we were doing. We stopped telling stories and began just doing pages of women being abused, and I was going, no, this is not what I signed on for. It's one thing where Wonder Woman stand-in is tied up for a couple of pages by a bad guy, and then she breaks loose and she comes out victorious in the end. That's a trope that you go with. You say, okay, that happens in adventure stories. When the whole point of the story is just how much abuse can be, dished out to somebody. No, at that point, I just said, I'm done here, and I walked away from it.
Yeah. No, absolutely. So we've got just a few minutes left. I want to ask two questions. The first question is, I read that at one point you had a Christian manga. Is that something that...
Serenity. This is, I'll try to give this story as fast as I can. Basically, I was Stan Lee's vice president of creative affairs, Stan Lee. And boy, if you want to have a wild story, have me on sometime to talk about Stan Lee Media. That's a story that one at least has nobody jumping buildings. And Stan asked me to develop a Christian comic book for the company, and I came up with basically Archie with an edge, is the way I described it. Serenity was the pitch was she's an unhappy girl who, thanks to her friends, finds a happy ending. And it was a comedic teen soap opera about this teenage girl who's, she's got problems of her own. She's been involved in drugs. She's, been having sex and whatnot, things like this. She is like one step away from being sent to a youth facility, for instance. And in the stories, mother moves to another community. She gets involved with these Christian kids who decide to help her straighten her life out. And we did about 10 volumes of her stories with two different publishers. And the second publisher, they just ended the series abruptly. And we said, no, well, let us keep it going as an ebook. I mean, let us do it online. I mean, this is, a lot more material here. And I said, ebooks are just starting to gain traction, and they just killed the whole project because we weren't making 50,000 sales every month. And so I own the rights to the characters. I have been working on Serenity stories. I've done a couple of Serenity short stories that were on my blog, but I'm still a ways out from relaunching her as a line of young adult prose novels. But that will eventually come, I promise. I'm not done telling her story yet.
Yeah, that's awesome. I hadn't heard that far into it. I feel our political views and probably religious views are pretty similar. I'm a big fan of the posts you make just about every day on Facebook and on Instagram with the artwork and adding in dialogue to the classic artwork.
Right. Yeah, I enjoy doing that. It's kind of like what Stan Lee did with he would do these monster books. He'd get photographs of stills from old monster movies, and he'd put funny captions on them and whatnot. I do the same thing with advertising art and illustrative art from the middle of the 20th century.
The other question. So your blog is buzzdixon.com.
Yes.
Is that where people should find most of your work? What projects are you working on?
Well, you will find most of my work there. The blog, we are right now changing over our software so that we can have a store page so that people can locate my books and whatnot online. I have a G.I. Joe novel out that people may be interested in. It's a Kindle Worlds novel called G.I. Joe, the Most Dangerous Man in the World, the Lost Classic G.I. Joe episode. Because as you remember, as I was telling you about the idea that I had, the fact that we brought Cobra Law in pretty much negated the idea that I wanted to do. So even though I had an outline, I never got a chance to write it or see it animated. It always kind of gnawed at me because I thought it was a good story. So when I heard about Kindle Worlds and that you could do a G.I. Joe story through Kindle Worlds, I got out the old outline, I expanded it into a novel, and you can find it now on Kindle Worlds. It takes place in an alternate timeline where there is no Serpentor, there is no Cobra Law. And it shows you what I would have done with the idea if I had had a chance to do it on the original series. I also have another young adult book coming out very soon called Poor Banished Children of Eve. And I describe this one as a World War II Lord of the Flies with Catholic schoolgirls.
I'm down. I'll be reading that. That's awesome. So, if you had a dream project, besides what you're doing right now, if money were no issue and you were just, yes, I'm going to make this happen, what would that project be?
Oh, geez, that's a good question. If there was a single dream project, if I had the money, I would adapt Alfred Bester's novel, The Star's My Destination, into a theatrical film. Because this is, like, in my opinion, the greatest sci-fi novel ever written. It is just incredibly cool. It's got incredible mind-boggling stuff in it. And at the end of it, the hero suffers a brain injury that scrambles his senses, so that he smells colors, he feels sounds. I mean, it's psychedelic the way that the book ends. It's just really bizarre and an incredible story. And it's a huge, sprawling space opera on top of everything else.
Wow. Very cool. Well, Buzz, I want to thank you so much for joining us, ladies and gentlemen. This has been Con Artist with Buzz Dixon. I hope you check out all of his work, buzzdixon.com. Should people find you other places on social media?
Well, find me at buzz.dixon.writer on Twitter and on Instagram. And I am found on Facebook as Buzz Dixon. And, it'll be pretty obvious you have the right Buzz Dixon when you click on the page.
That's excellent. Yeah, thank you so much for coming. Cuddle Buddy Frankie, thank you for producing. We need to make sure to thank executive producer Larry and animal wrangler Charlene. Buzz, I appreciate your friendship. I continue looking forward to seeing what you post on Facebook every day. Thank you so much for joining us. Hopefully I can set it up so we get to work at another con someday. So,
I hope so. Great fun. Great fun.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Thank you, everyone, for this. We are going to have a special episode this weekend where we'll be talking with Terry Malloy, and that name should be familiar if you're a Whovian or like Doctor Who, because he was the very first Davros. And so we've got to make a special call across the pond and get to talk to him this weekend. We'll see you all either at that time this Sunday or next Thursday for Con Artists. Thank you very much.